So we have with us Ashish Advani, who's who's from Junior Achievement Worldwide and also the chair of Prosperity Now. Wei-Lin Lee from PayPal, senior director. And Gary Cunningham from MEDA, Metropolitan Economic Development Association. He's the president and CEO. So we've heard a little bit about what PayPal is doing in this area, what Intuit is doing in this area. But Wei-Lin, I wanted to know a little bit more about how PayPal thinks about the value of partnerships and how PayPal also can work to motivate economic mobility and financial security.
Yeah. So economic mobility is so important to us, and it's actually part of our corporate mission. So some of you may not know that we used to be owned by eBay, which is the e-commerce marketplace, but 3 years ago we split. And it was at that time that we realized we could really drive our vision around this issue of financial security and figure out the contribution we wanted to make. And so since then, some of the ways we're stepping into this issue is one, like elevating the financially underserved as a key customer segment that we're focusing on. Two, we have reoriented the way we do innovation. And so putting the customer front and center. And so working with various partners to go into the PayPal teams across the globe have gone into the homes of hundreds of financially underserved customers, sat on their couches, listened to their stories, really tried to understand the characteristics within this different group, understand the pain points and their needs, and then build a set of products around this. And that's what I appreciate about being here in these couple of days and being in conversation with folks in this room to help us develop that solution and refine kind of our first product offerings.
That's great. I'm going to ask you a little bit about the product offerings a little bit later. But Ashish, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the partnerships you have and how what we've been talking about here, economic mobility and financial security, are reflected in the partnerships that you've been pursuing.
Sure. Well, I'm here with two hats on, so I'll wear them both really quickly in answering your question. So first of all, Prosperity Now, I'm so proud to be on the board. I'm so proud to see all of you here today and the hard work that the staff has done on making this conference happen. So that's one hat. The second hat is my Junior Achievement Worldwide hat on. And I think both organizations share something which I hope to talk about in the rest of my comments, which is we're both networks. And the Prosperity Now community, many of you who are part of it now, if you're the first time here and if you've come here before, you, I think, know what CFED built and what Prosperity Now is building. The power of building a network, an alliance, a community, a coalition, if we genuinely believe that the problem of mobility, what I call inequality, is one which we collectively want to solve, and I believe, honestly, if we don't solve it, the world is headed to a really bad place. If we collectively believe that, we all probably also know that our own individual organizations can't solve it on our own. The organizational form of being part of a network or coalition is the social organizational form that creates change. So the way I think of partnerships might be a little bit different, which is being part of an association, a community, a coalition is a way to partner that is sustainable and creates real impact. JA, with my JA hat on now, we're a large global network in 116 countries. And now we're one of the largest networks to reach young people in the world. So we have CEOs in 116 countries, including here in the US, where we have 109 local CEOs in a bunch of different markets. And the power of, I think, the collaboration and shared mission allows us individually in the JA network to partner in a way that creates clarity of mission and clarity of what we're actually cooperating on. And that's the hard part in partnerships, to make them sustainable. So I'll just stop there and give you more examples later.
Great, thank you. Gary, you're the president and CEO of MEDA. And I'm sure that when you first joined, you thought about partnerships, and there were probably partnerships already that you were pursuing. Tell me how your approach to partnerships has both continued and changed as you've evolved in that role?
Right. Well, META is made up of, was originally created by the Fortune 500s in Minnesota. Part of that was when they originally got started, they thought about it as charity. Now we've shifted to think about this is actually a solution to the problems that we see. And if we're going to be, maintain our competitive place in the marketplace around the world, we actually have to utilize those talents, those people, those institutions that we haven't used in the past because the world is changing, the demographics are changing. So when I sit down with Brian Cornell or Doug Baker, folks that are running major corporations, what they're thinking about now wasn't what they're thinking about 10 years ago in terms of solutions to problems. Part of the reason they're looking at smaller companies, companies of color to actually see them accelerate is because many of them have gotten their lunch eaten by these same companies that are growing and expanding, and they're actually coming to the table saying, hey, we need to incorporate these companies into our solution. And so part of the reason they now partner with META in a different way is because we are actually building entrepreneurs of color, which are the future of America, future of our place. The other thing, and I really like this 51%, I just thought that was fantastic, in part because if you're a partner and you're just in it for yourself, and you just think about your end of the deal, then in fact, the partnership won't work. And so what we do at META, both in our corporate partnerships and our partnership with other nonprofits, is we really try to focus on how do we actually help them do better? How do we become the best partners? And so what we found both in the corporate sector and the value added proposition that we bring to the table is that when we're actually operating in the interests of that partnership, as opposed to our self-interest, we actually all do better.
Excellent, thank you very much. So one of the interesting things about corporate and nonprofit partnerships is that often when you think of it just on the face of it, nonprofits have a different set of goals than their corporate partners. And so the next question I'm going to ask each of our panelists to reflect on really tees up that kind of tension. And so the question is, when we think about corporate partnerships, the issue of bringing things to scale is particularly relevant. And so I want each of you to kind of give me your reflections on how you have managed and engaged with that particular challenge. Rajneesh, I'll start with you, and then we'll move forward.
Yeah, sure. So from Intuit's perspective, what we are focused on is really finding, and our founder, Scott Cook, founded this framework. What we look at is finding big, important customer problems that we or our partners can solve really well. So that's the intersection that we want to work at. So for us, it's really a question of, whoever we partner with, can we find some big customer problems that both of us can be focused on and solve them really well. And the question of scale is a good one, and it's a great question to ask. The way we look at it is the scale doesn't necessarily need to come from solving the problem if the problem's big enough with just one customer, but scale can come by repeating and scaling that across multiple partners, which is what my team is trying to do. So for example, with financial institutions, we are focused on finding 2 or 3 big, great integrations that will really power economic mobility. And then we want to scale that with financial institutions all across the globe that we partner with.
Great, thank you very much. Ashish?
So if we think about how young people are facing the future of the world, that might define how we think of partnership. The average young person is probably going to have at least 20 jobs over the course of their life, which means they're probably going to get fired 5 times, right? And for any of you who've been fired, I've been fired. It's a, you go through a period of like, oh my God, what's going to happen to me next, right? And this is going to happen to the next generation many, many times. So to be able to build the resilience to get through that many transitions, potentially even career transitions, not just job transitions, where you've got to reskill, that skill, I'll call it resilience or perseverance, is something which is a mindset. And you can expose young people to experiences at a young age which build that mindset. So when we think of partnership and we go and talk to our corporate partners, we have partnerships with more than half of the Fortune 500 and global partnerships. And we, I think, really approach it as a true win-win to prepare young people for the job market of the future. And we have that dialogue about what actually is the problem that the corporation wants to solve to prepare young people for, and how can we use our assets to help solve that problem.
Excellent, thank you. Wei Lin?
Yeah, so we think of scale as just one measure of success. But if you think about a company that's trying to achieve long-term and sustainable growth, then scale and success is really a consequence of really adding value to the customer. And when we think about adding value to the customer, then I think local and corporate needs aren't so different. Like the language may be different, but I think the intent is the same. And so when you think about scale, as Shriti was saying, it's really around understanding and serving pockets of local needs. And that's why I'm really excited about our work with Prosperity and working with folks in this room, because bringing the expertise, we know that we have a lot to learn in this space, and so I think that partnership is very exciting.
Can you give us some examples of products that might have benefited from this thinking about scale in a very holistic way?
Yeah, so actually across all our products, we're a global company, and so in the discovery process that I spoke of before, we go into markets across the world, we work with local communities and trying to understand needs that way. In the particular suite we have right now, it's, we've gone to homes of the underserved and tried to figure out what is the best way to help this group access affordable financial services. How do we get this group to be able to be part of the digital economy? And so part of that is making it easy for them to put cash into a digital wallet, finding easy ways for them to save for goals and invest. And then on the other end, take money out of that digital wallet into the real world.
Great, thank you. Gary?
So I'm going to take your question in a little different direction, because for the last year I've spent in a group called Itasca, which is the CEOs of some of the largest companies in America. And part of the conversation's been around this question of how do we solve the issue of poverty and then actually create a workforce that's going to work for us tomorrow. One of the things that became very clear in the discussion is that there were different mental models in the room about what are the solutions to these issues. On the one hand, you had folks that said it was an individual issue, individual initiative, et cetera. And then on the other hand, you had folks talking about it being systems. Until we could come to an understanding about what is the problem and what are we trying to solve for, we couldn't get to scale, we couldn't get to any of these things, in part because we had different views about this. The other thing is that just because you're a corporate executive doesn't mean that you understand or can relate to issues of people. Even if you came from a low-income community, you may not be able to understand the dynamics because these issues aren't solved in a technical manner. So you come with a technical solution to a problem, but those technical solutions, because of how the problems have developed, how you really believe about race, for example. What do you really believe about these issues? If that's not on the table, if you're not able to talk about those issues, you can't get to a solution because you're always coming out of that mental model. We have been able to make a lot of progress and get some things to scale in part, but we had to go through a process before we got there. And some of the impatience of getting to the next quarter's profits or et cetera, don't allow for that dialogue to take place. We've been able to work with, for example, Accenture recently on an IT platform that we believe that will transform how entrepreneurs of color access capital, access technical assistance, and access support. And that platform that we're designing really should be scaled nationwide so that there's entrepreneurs of color don't have to go to different places, can come to one place and get what they need. And now people are starting to see after this long dialogue that we can actually get there with a technical solution, but we had to go through the actual mental model in order to get there.
That's really interesting, and you know, I think it makes it really clear that we all come to this problem with different pieces of information, right? And a lot of problem solving together with partnerships is really about level setting and making sure we're all working with the same information. And it sounds like you've done a lot of hard work to be able to do that, and I'm sure that's true when we think about partnerships in general. So let me, with that in mind, let me ask you know, each of you the following question, which is, and let me sort of give it some context, which is that, you know, we've been at this conference, and everyone who works in this space knows that economic mobility is something that is very difficult for people of color in particular in the US. And there's a lot of data that has shown historically there are reasons for that. Some of it has to do with racism and bigotry and the systemic effects of that. And so one of the things I'm going to ask you is, as we think about the demographic trends in the US, so now more than half of the kids under 10 years old in the US are kids of color. When we think about that, and we join that with the fact that people of color have a more difficult time making it in the US, what do you think is the role of corporate entities in particular, but also corporate partnerships, in completely reversing that trend? So, I'm giving you a moment to think of an answer. And I'm going to start with Gary, because I bet you guys have thought about that a little bit.
Absolutely. Corporations are made, I mean, corporations are made up of people, right? So they're not these like something different. And what we found is that many of those people in corporations want to give their time, energy, talent, and attention to these issues. And in fact, I would argue that if the corporation isn't allowing that to happen within their space, then they're not going to get the full value of that, of the folks that are working there. So what we found is that many of those folks actually do things in community and want to connect up with community, don't know how, don't understand what the issues are. And so what we've been working on is really creating corporate partners, both ethnic specific, so around Latino issues, around African American issues, around Native American issues, so that people can actually plug in where their heart is, first of all. The second thing is this issue of respect and relationship, power and influence. A lot of times folks come to the table with nonprofit organizations or people in the community, and they come with their own answers. They've been educated, et cetera, around a certain problem-solving methodology. But it really is what I find people in the community have the wisdom around the issues that they're talking about. So giving them the full respect of that they actually have done things in their community, they actually know what's happening. We spend, I'll just take just one brief. We spent a lot of time with these CEOs, and they came in with the specific solutions. And it took us a while to get to a point of, hey, there are really great things happening in these communities already. What is your role in amping those things up or joining with those things that connect with what you're already doing? That was a transformation point. But you know, we always talk about transformation, change. These things are painful. And if you're not willing to go on the journey as a corporation or a corporate leader, and when things get difficult, you pull out or you do something else, then we're never going to get there. I do think the role of, I actually think corporations actually sit right now in America at the pinnacle of making change happen. We're not going to get it at the federal government right now. Everybody knows that. And the corporate sector actually could play a huge role in helping to transform America. But it has to do it in partnership with people on the ground doing this work.
Thank you. I think that was a very, very thoughtful answer, and it's clear that you've already kind of covered a lot of this ground in the work that you're doing. And the great thing about Gary is that it was long enough, that answer was long enough to give everybody else a chance to think about what their answer is. So with that, Waylon.
Thanks, Gary. Look, I think what Gary is saying is exactly right? The world is expecting corporations to play a different role as we think about leveling the economic playing field and stand for more than their bottom line, right? And so how do we act out of our core values that may at times be different from our financial interests? So for us, I mean, that started with broadening what we see as our stakeholders. So in addition to obviously our fiduciary duty to our shareholders, we think about our customers, we think about the people who work for us, we think about our partners. And that's led to actions like, we were one of the first major corporations to pull out North Carolina. So from a financial perspective, not in our best interest, but from a values perspective, like very imperative. And so as we think about, people of color, people not of color, we're committed to those business decisions and actions to right that ship.
Thank you very much. Ashish?
So it's really interesting. It comes down to how you change the mindset of an adult who's got a set of experiences that are different than other people's experiences, people of color or not people of color, people who come from wealthy backgrounds or not. And one of the things I've noticed, and I'll speak from a JA perspective first and then toggle to Prosperity Now, but is when what we call a corporate volunteer, but really an individual who goes into a classroom and interacts with kids of color or kids from sort of poor neighborhoods, you can see mindsets shift, partly because they've actually never been in a school like that before. So I know you were a volunteer for JA some years ago, but you can imagine even spending one day in a classroom and empathizing with what a teacher has to go through. You chip at changing mindsets. But it's just a chip, honestly. To be frank, it takes so much more than that to truly change mindsets. I do think corporate philanthropy globally is changing, not just in the US. There's all sorts of different words, sort of fancy titles about how it's changing. But in general, I think there's a recognition that corporations have a social obligation, that famous BlackRock memo of about 12 months ago now, which sort of put it on the table even for the people who fund corporations, right? The limited partners, the hedge fund managers, and the fund managers who now have to rethink the way they evaluate their investment decisions. Having it start at that part of the value chain, frankly, I think is really critical. It makes it so much easier for the champions from the two corporations on the panel to be able to do their job. And then from a Prosperity Now standpoint, God, the fact that we're doing the racial wealth gap work makes the issue data-driven and more urgent. If you think of the climate change movement, the reason we've made so much progress globally on climate change is people recognized it was an urgent problem, and there was data behind it, and it was a way to get stakeholders together from business and government and civil society to agree on things. We haven't had that happen in the mobility movement and the inequality movement in a way that truly creates change. So that's why I'm so excited about the work.
Great. Thank you very much, Rajneesh.
Yeah, my answer is very similar to what everybody has already said. I think corporations have a big role to play, and not just a role, they have responsibility. Ashish referred to the BlackRock memo of social responsibility every organization has. The approach we take at Intuit is really about understanding the underlying drivers that get people stuck in the cycle of poverty and prevents the economic mobility. And then we try to address those drivers, which helps everybody who is being impacted by those drivers, including the people of color. I'll take an example of a recent partnership we did with Chase. A lot of people here are familiar with tax time and how exciting, at the same time emotional it is for several Americans, because it's the biggest paycheck of the year for many, but they're also worried about making mistakes. But Chase had a big focus on helping their consumers, their customers, save. So we partnered with them, since tax time is such a big paycheck for many of their customers. We partnered with them so that when they get their tax refund, instead of spending their tax dollars in things that they may not have fully thought through, we offered them tools and we offered them information on how they could more intelligently make choices for how to spend their tax dollars. And the campaign was really, really successful through that. the customers of TurboTax deposited $5 billion into Chase savings and checking account and made right choices of using their tax refund dollars.
That's huge. That's really huge. Thank you all. So I have another kind of tough question for you guys. And I'm going to start with Gary again for the same reasons. So let me just really quickly summarize one of the findings from the Mobility from Poverty Partnership from Mobility from Poverty. And one of those findings is that it's really going to be important when we think about economic mobility to start changing the narrative around poverty. And so the quick version of that narrative is if you're very successful, it's because you as an individual are just incredibly brilliant and have worked really, really hard. And if you somehow are not successful, likewise, it's an individual failing. You clearly are too lazy to work hard, and there's some sort of, competence or intellectual deficit. Okay, just boiling it down to the basics. To complicate things, that particular narrative is very much utilized when we think about African American boys in the U.S. And added to that is an additional stereotype that not only are they lazy and not intellectually competent, but also prone to violence. So that combination tends to drive a lot of the results that you see in economic mobility, in the wealth gap, et cetera. So I'm going to kind of set the table there. So changing the narrative is going to be really important if we are going to really transcend the economic mobility problems that we have now. All of you work at some level with or in service of or for small business entrepreneurs and small businesses in general. Tell me how your work with small businesses in particular could help counter that narrative and create a different kind of narrative. Gary.
Well, one, all the data that's recently come out shows that entrepreneurship is one way to level the playing field. That if in fact people of color are more into and a part of the whole business creation system, they hire their own people, they actually create economic value in community and money generates in those communities, et cetera. So let's start there with that premise that entrepreneurship is going to be a key in addressing the gap. I do spend a lot of time thinking about that we've been framing these issues around equity, access, and opportunity, but I actually think that many whites don't see themselves in that picture. When we talk about equity, they don't see themselves. They don't see their kids. They don't see themselves. And so I think we need a new language. We need to talk about this differently so that everybody sees themselves in the picture as we go through this process. And we don't have the language yet about that, but it's important that everybody see themselves no matter where they've been in the power structure, because if we rely just on what's happened historically, we will never get there from here. I mean, Prosperity Now, through its racial wealth gap initiative, actually did an analysis that showed it would take 240 years for African Americans to get at an equal playing field with whites. So the question is if in fact that is the case, and we're going to get there in the next generation, what do we need to do, right? And so, and that's going to mean some real different thinking about what the inputs are that are going to get us there. And it's not going to be the thinking that we're using today. Because if we use the thinking we're using today, we will never get there from here. So part of my answer to you is we need to actually step back from the kind of framework that we have, and we need to really start thinking about a new framework around all of us doing well together. This system, this society should work equally well for everyone.
Thank you very much. Ashish, you look like you're ready to go, so I'm going to let you go, and then.
So Gary, thank you for teeing that up. so we have a great partnership with MEDA where we target young boys or young men of color with JA and MEDA. And I'll tell you, changing the narrative, particularly doing so at a national level, is a different challenge than changing it at a micro level. I'll just start by saying that. But your question was, how do you change it at a national level? So I'll answer it at a national level. So we believe today, we as society, that you have to do well in school and get good grades, so you get into and do well on standardized tests, so you can have a college education. That's a sort of a kind of becoming a bedrock belief of America. That, in a data-driven way, is unrelated at all to entrepreneurial success. So your question was, you know, how do we use entrepreneurship to change the narrative? The good news is there's a whole lot of organizations, not just Junior Achievement, a whole lot of organizations that believe that that narrative is wrong. And the world is moving in a direction where soft skills, not hard skills, or non-cognitive skills, are more and more important for success, not just as entrepreneurs, but for individuals. Our education system is not built to measure progress on non-cognitive skills. Things like self-efficacy, believing in one's own abilities. We don't measure progress on that dimension, but that is a far greater predictor of success than your SAT score. And certainly on the dimension of being a job-creating entrepreneur, it is 10 times more predictor plus of your ability to be a successful job-creating entrepreneur. So I believe, and there's some very, very simple things that we can do to change the narrative. One is to start to value these soft skills in our evaluation. And once again, there's some good news. Believe it or not, this stuff is actually being measured even by the College Board and test-taking organizations. So this is kind of happening. So personally, I'm very optimistic that we as society will be moving in the right direction, even if we're pulled because of market forces, not pushed because of conversations like this.
Thank you very much. Wei Ling?
Yeah, let me give you one example. Part of the ways we want to help this group is we focus on helping entrepreneurs who have a different starting point or startups that actually are aiming for social impact. And we do a couple of things. One, working with some of our capital partners to help fund some of these startups. And two, we bring these entrepreneurs into our company, and we use our employees and help coach them and develop them throughout the process. And so to arm them with the tools and enable them to be successful.
Great, thank you very much. Rajneesh?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to start by saying that the narrative that somebody's poor because they don't work hard is completely misguided and totally wrong. If you look at the data, poor people in America actually work much harder than those who have financial flexibility, and we need to recognize that. The way we are trying to make a difference is by celebrating the hard work that small businesses do, and we try to do that in everything we do in all our PR communications, but also we try to be their voice with larger organizations like financial institutions, government bodies, and also educational institutions. So we can, we have much greater access as larger Intuit than individual small business owners or a consumer has. So we try to be their voice and represent their voice with these organizations.
Great, thank you very much. Any last words when you're thinking about the intersection between financial security, economic mobility, the geography in which people live, and your role as a corporate partner?
Well, one size doesn't fit all. There are places that are rich in corporate support because the corporations are there. There are places in rural areas of our country and reservation communities where there are no corporate people there. And so the question becomes, how do we ensure that whatever happens in these spaces that they're at, that gets spread to places where they're not. There are nonprofits that are doing great work all over this country, people in this room that don't have the relationships with a corporation. And so the question is how do we think about this differently? One of the things that we've been working on is how do we think about the ecosystem that people are operating in rather than individual nonprofits. The model both in philanthropy and in corporate giving has been, we're going to focus on this organization and then the next organization, et cetera, and we build partners one at a time. When I actually think we need to think about systems and structures. And if we can think about systems and structures and actually fund those structures and fund those ecosystems, then all of us in this room that are working on the ground can take advantage of the innovations that are coming out of these partnerships. And I think as the corporations that are in the room think about what they're doing, they have to think less about individual organizations and that one thing they're going to do, and more about these structures and ecosystems that they're working in.
Thank you. Rajneesh?
Yeah, my comment was very much like what Gary said. I think we are increasingly doing a better job of one-on-one partnerships, corporations with not-for-profits, corporations with governments, but we need to do more to think about it like a value-creating system where multiple organizations and multiple entities can come together, be it educational institutions, financial institutions, governments, corporations, all of them come together in a value creation system aligned by their individual missions and their collective mission of economic mobility.
Great, thank you. Wei-Lin?
I think we're all going to say very similar things.
Good.
I mean, look, no one organization can do it alone. And so how do we come together and take down our walls and share our assets to create that better answer for the ecosystem? I think that's the question we're trying to answer.
Great, thank you. Ashish, you have the last word.
You're letting me back clean up. I love it. I'll try to tie to this conference to make it even tighter, shall we say. We're talking about how we work together and why systems change is important. Thank you for that language, Gary. The beauty of, I think, this conference and the community and the network that's being created is that's our theory of change. That is what we believe will actually lead to a material change in mobility inequality. And we've actually, on the Board of Prosperity Now, if I could share, we've set quantitative targets of how to do this with systems change, which is scary because, frankly, we don't control the system. So to take that kind of bold step, I'll thank the leadership team for being willing to do that, I think is kind of what it's going to take to be a catalyst to actually make this cooperation happen. So thank you for this panel.
Thank you. And on that last word, please join me in giving this fantastic panel a round of applause.